Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the victorious church in our continuing study of a history of Christianity. As he lay dying on the battlefield, Julian the Apostate, emperor of Rome, supposedly raised his fist to the sky and yelled out, "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean." But the victory of the church starts much earlier than that. Tertullian, in the 3rd century, writes in his Apologeticus. He says, "We are but of yesterday, and we've filled every place among you, cities, islands, fortresses, towns, marketplaces, the very camp, tribes, companies, palace, senate, forum." There were Christians to be found in every strata of society. As we look at our timeline, of course, we had the church persecuted by Rome, and now we're going to see the Edict of Toleration early in the 4th century. Our story here begins with Diocletian, the Roman emperor, who comes on the scene at a time of political instability. There was a runaway inflation, a pending civil collapse. The entire empire was about to fall apart. And he comes on the scene, a very strong leader. The first thing Diocletian does is calls for a division of the empire. It's going to still be one empire, but it will be divided administratively into two parts. You'll have the east and you'll have the west. And so he appoints a series of first of all, he gets another emperor. He's emperor. He'll rule in the east. He'll get another emperor to rule the west. And then, because every time an emperor dies, there has been a civil war or an upheaval, and he says we need to have a smooth transition of power so that when it comes, it will be smooth and without fighting, without war, without civil collapse. And so he's going to be the emperor in the east. He'll pick another emperor to be the emperor in the west, and they will each choose a sub-emperor, not their son, not somebody who's related to them, not nepotism, but instead somebody who is qualified to take their place, and that individual will be emperor in training. That doesn't sound very official, so we'll refer to them as the Caesar. So you've got the two emperors and then two Caesars. Notice how they're using that not as a name anymore, but as a title. And these two Caesars, the idea is when the emperors, not when they die, when they retire. When they retire, then the two Caesars will become the two new emperors, and they will choose themselves two new Caesars. That's the plan. Now, in the early 300s, he is convinced he's chosen one of those Caesars. Galerius is his emperor in training for the East. And Galerius actually convinces Diocletian to begin a persecution of Christianity. Christianity was technically illegal, but nobody had really been enforcing that law. There was sort of a don't ask, don't tell policy. And Galerius convinces Diocletian to wipe out the Christians. And Diocletian never did anything halfway. There were no half measures with him. So he begins this persecution, and he begins it with a vengeance. Come 305 AD, Diocletian decides it's time to step down. The plan that he had arranged, he would step down at the same time the emperor in the west would step down. He says the emperor in the west, time to step down. Emperor in the west says, I don't want to step down. You're going to step down. I really don't want to do it. If you don't step down, I'll come and conquer you and put you to death. Okay, I suppose I'll step down. And so there's that step down. No sooner had he done it than trouble begins to rise up. He steps back up and he says, if you guys don't behave, I'll come back. Okay, we'll behave. And now Galerius, just a few years later, becomes very sick. Now remember, they've been persecuting the Christians in a very intense persecution, hunting them down, leaving no stone unturned. And then Galerius gets very, very sick. So sick that he feels he's going to die. And he calls out to the Christians, will you pray for me? If you pray for me, I will pass an edict of toleration that will stop the persecutions. Here's the edict, as quoted from Eusebius, the early church historian. Christians may again exist and rebuild the houses in which they used to meet, because there had been times when they built churches, on condition that they do nothing contrary to public order. And he passed the edict, and the Christians pray. Of course, I'm not exactly sure how they prayed. I'm not sure if that was part of the agreement. And because I think it was about 5 days later, that Galerius dies. And he dies with the Edict of Toleration intact. And so, at least temporarily, on that side of the empire, the persecutions have paused, if not stopped completely. Now we have enter the main event, and his name is Constantine. His father is one of those sub-emperors, and his soldiers decide, you need to be, forget the stuff about Caesar, you need to be an emperor yourself. And so he sets out to make himself the new emperor. And his chief rival is the sub-emperor that is there in Rome. And so he takes his army from England. He'd been stationed in Britain. And he marches on Rome. In 312, he arrives at the outskirts of Rome on the north side of the city. You have this bridge called the Milvian Bridge. It's the bridge going toward the north. And the Caesar, he has a great position. All he has to do is stay behind the river. And he's got twice as many troops, and he's got the tremendous position. And Constantine is not to be deterred. He's going to go forward. The story that he tells is that night he has a dream, and he sees this image of what was recognized as a Christian symbol. It is the 2 letters, looks like just a couple of squirrelies and lines, but actually there's a letter that looks a little bit like an X. That's the key. It's the first letter for the word Christos. And then that symbol in the middle that looks a little bit like a P, that's not a P, that's a rho. The key rho symbol are the first 2 letters for the word Christos, or Christ. And in his dream, he hears a voice saying, in this sign, conquer. And so he gets up the next morning and he says, I know what we're going to do. We're going to put on our banners this symbol. And he has them put on the banners, painted on the shields. Everything that's not standing still receives this symbol, this Christian symbol. And then he goes to battle. And for some unknown reason, the Caesar that was safely there in Rome behind the Milvian Bridge brings his army across the bridge to fight Constantine, which means that he's got his back to the river. And in the ensuing battle, he's driven back across the bridge, and he falls into the water and he drowns. And it turns out to be the easiest victory that anybody ever could have imagined. Constantine has won the victory. And the first thing he does, he says, I guess I'm going to be a Christian. After all, he says, it was Jesus, it was Christ, it was the symbol Christos that won me the victory. Now, he knew a little bit about Christianity. After all, his mother, who had been sort of a commoner, and then had been married to this up-and-coming general, his mother had become a Christian. Helena was her name. And perhaps she had told him a bit about Jesus. But now he says, I want to be a Christian. What is a Christian anyway? I suppose I ought to make some Christian friends and find out. And so one of the early things that he does, he re-releases that edict of toleration, actually expands on it. So it will now be called the Edict of Milan. And that expands that edict of toleration, and it gives Christians the right to worship all throughout the empire. Well, sort of, except that he's not quite yet in control of the empire. It's going to be an uphill battle for the next 11 years before the dust finally settles. But in the interim, at least where Constantine is, there's no more persecution. And so over the next number of years, he works to reunify the Roman Empire. No more east-west. He's going to be the emperor of all of it, and he makes it stick. By 324, when the dust is finally settled, now he gives Christianity not just legalized status, he gives it favored religion status. It will be the favored religion. It's not the only religion in the Roman Empire. There's still paganism. There's still other things. But it is now given favored status. Now, as a favored religion, the bishops in the church are given the right to judge civil cases as long as it's Christians involved. They don't have to go to a secular court. They can go to the church. Secondly, Sunday is made into a public holiday. Prior to this, the Romans knew about the Jewish 7-day week, but they hadn't really followed that in the past. In the past, they actually didn't even have weeks. And the idea of taking 1 week and 1 day a week off, that was considered by the Romans of a previous era as being downright silly. But now, the 7-day week and Sunday made into a public holiday, and eventually there's a new sort of edict of toleration where Christians aren't allowed to persecute pagans. Now, before Constantine, we'd had a high degree of purity within the church. Because after all, somebody only declared they were going to be a Christian at great risk to themselves. But after Constantine, it's going to be much easier to be a Christian. In fact, it's going to be, after a while, it's going to be popular to become a Christian. And as that popularity increases, the purity within the church has an opposite movement. It will decrease. Before Constantine, there were long periods of catechism training before receiving baptism. Remember how we talked about Tertullian, who suggested you might want to wait before getting baptized. You'll wash away all your sins, and then if you sin again after that, you'll be in real trouble. So learn what you're getting into before you get baptized and become a Christian. After Constantine, the requirements to become a Christian are going to be minimized. Just believe and be baptized, and now you're in. In fact, Constantine himself is going to delay baptism, again, for the same reason we talked about before. A king, somebody in authority, who might have to have people put to death, wanted to wait until just before they died to be baptized, because then you have all those sins forgiven when you're baptized and wash away sins, and then you can sort of go into heaven with a clean slate. That was the idea. It was bad theology. Let me just say that. We don't urge that today for Christians. Baptism ought to come very early on. Before Constantine, Christians were known for their very strict lifestyle. After Constantine, that tends to get a bit looser. Before Constantine, there was a martyr mentality among the pious. Remember how Ignatius has said, I can't wait for the lions to come and eat me. Don't try to save me. Don't dissuade, may they have a great feast. I'm ready to go die for Jesus. After Constantine, there are still those who want to serve the Lord, but you can't be put to death for your faith because now your faith is legal. And so there's going to be a shift. From now on, it will be a monastic mentality that begins to emerge among the pious. And we'll actually come back and look at the monasteries and the whole monastic movement that begins to develop. It had already begun, but now we'll move into a high gear. The other thing Constantine decides to do is he looks at where Rome is, and Rome was a rundown city. In fact, Milan was more the seat of the government to the northwest of Rome. But he needs a new capital, a capital to deal with those things in the east where all the action is. And so he picks a spot. There had been a village there many years earlier called Byzantium. And that's why sometimes we'll refer to it as the Byzantines, sometimes even the Byzantine Empire, when Rome is finally divided. But it's going to be, for right now, called Constantinople, named after Constantine himself. In fact, that name is going to stick until recent times. If you go to that city today it's called Istanbul. But it's going to be Constantinople for the next 1,000 years. And it will be the new capital of the Roman Empire for the next 1,000 years. And so he forms the city. It's actually perfectly positioned. It's on this narrow channel, the Bosphorus that connects the Black Sea with the Sea of Mamre, and then further south with the Aegean. And it's located on a peninsula jutting out into that navigable waterway, so that you have it's surrounded on really three sides by water, and on the fourth side would be erected these very high, impregnable walls that would not fall until gunpowder and cannon were invented in the mid 1400s. Now that everybody's become a Christian, it's become legalized. One of the controversies that rises up, the Donatist controversy, named after Donatus Magnus. He's alive there at the time of Constantine, dies in 355. And the question that he brings up is, what about those who have been baptized or married by fallen bishops? You see, there had been bishops, not a lot of them, but some of them, who under threat of persecution had either run away or, worse still, had perhaps even denied the faith. And everybody agreed, now that the dust settled, they could no longer be bishops. They had, after all, denied Jesus. Whether it was active denying by just saying, no, we're going to, under threat of torture, we're going to deny Jesus, or passive resistance, where they had run away from their churches to escape persecution. But in any case, for a time, they had been bishops, maybe in some cases for quite a long time. And while they were bishops, they had baptized new believers, they had married people, they had ordained other clergy, and now they're being removed from office. But here's the question: what about those people that have been baptized or married or ordained by these fallen bishops? Did their marriage count? Did their baptism count? Did those ordinations count? Or do we have to go back to square one and check the pedigree of every single fallen bishop and see who he influenced? You know, I have a personal story that's very much like that. When Paula and I, we'd been married for a few years. Our daughter had already been born, and the pastor who married us had a huge moral failure. Actually left his wife and went running off with some young girl, and it made national news. It really was a big deal. He was a well-known Christian leader, and sad and tragic event. But what was interesting was Paula's grandmother called us into her living room, sat us down, very serious, and said, John and Paula, do you think that you ought to get married again? After all, he's no longer a minister. Did it take? did that cancel out something? Like I said, we'd already been married a few years, and our daughter had been born, and we laughed and we said, no, Mom, it's fine. We're still married. It did not depend on his holiness. And the church comes to the same conclusion. Now, Donatus doesn't come to the same conclusion. He actually tries to split the church and say he's the only real guy that's being holy. But the church declares him to be a heretic because he's trying to divide the church. And the church says, no, it's the position, not the person. Now, after the death of Constantine, the empire falls to his three sons, Constantius and Constans and Constantine II, and it's not long before they're fighting each other. And at the end of the day, you say, well, which one wins? At the end of the day, none of them. They all end up dying. And so it's a nephew, a cousin nephew, who ends up coming to the throne, to the leadership of Rome in their place. And that nephew is Julian, and he's going to get the nickname the Apostate, who becomes emperor from 361, only going to last 2 years. Julian had been raised by Constantine. His parents had actually been put to death many years earlier. And he had been raised in the church. When he becomes emperor, they do the ceremony. They declare him to be emperor in the church, nephew to Constantine the Great. And as soon as he is made emperor, he walks out of the church and never sets foot again. He had been playing the part, but had never been really a Christian. So he immediately renounces Christianity, and he's going to seek to restore paganism. Now, it's hard to turn back the wheels because a lot of people have now become Christians, people in high-ranking places. I'm not saying everybody was, but quite a few. And so it's not that he's going to make it illegal to be a Christian, but he is going to try to convince people that paganism is better than Christianity. One of the things he tries to do is he says, I'm going to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, not because he has any fondness for the Jews, because he feels that it will be an affront to the Christians and sort of a slap in their face, an insult to them. And so he's trying to do whatever he can do to undermine Christianity. He now takes his army to invade Persia. And it's while he is on that foreign battlefield that he is hit with an arrow, and he's lying on the field. And the story goes, it's a later story, maybe apocryphal, that he raises his hand to heaven and says, "You have won after all, O Galilean." 2 years, and now he's done. And every emperor after this will, at least in name, be a Christian. One of those emperors, he's not the next, but there's one or two in between. This is Theodosius, emperor from 379 to 395. It will be Theodosius who ends state support for paganism, saying, look, we're going to support Christianity instead of paganism. They were both legal, but he puts an end to the Olympic Games, way too pagan for him. All these gods, these Greek gods, these Greek Olympic gods, and prayers that would be done to them. We're not going to do that anymore. He also is excommunicated by the Bishop Ambrose. Ambrose is the Bishop of Milan. There had been a riot in Thessalonica, and Theodosius had gone in and put it in, and as he had put that riot down, 7,000 of the Roman citizens there in Thessalonica had been killed in the military action that put down the riot. And Ambrose said, "You were supposed to find a more peaceful way to put down that riot. You're not. If you're going to be an emperor, a Christian emperor, you're going to be doing these things for the Lord. If you're serving the Lord, then you cannot do that. You need to repent, and until you repent, you cannot partake of communion. We're going to treat you as if you're an unbeliever. We're going to treat you as a pagan." And Theodosius, you think, well, one of the early emperors would have just wiped out the church. No, Theodosius says, "You're right. Okay, I will repent." I'm not sure he liked it, but he does. He repents and is publicly restored by Ambrose. Now, a revolt breaks out by a Eugenius who is saying, we need to bring back the old Roman gods. And they fight an epic battle, the year 394, on the battle of on the river Phrygius, probably a cold river coming down from the mountains, hence the name. And even though I'm sure there were other reasons why they were fighting, they were probably political and they were financial, but it's billed as a war between the Christians versus the pagans, with Theodosius on the side of the Christians, now that his excommunication has been restored, and Eugenius on the side of the pagans. Let's make Rome great again by going back to paganism. And Theodosius wins, and this is paganism's last hurrah, because Rome from now on will be a quote-unquote Christian empire. Sometimes I wonder how Christian it will be, but at least in name, it's going to be a Christian empire. Jerome, the famed translator of the Greek and Hebrew Bible into Latin, in the year 378 has this to say: "From India to Britain, all nations resound with the death and resurrection of Christ." Christianity had indeed conquered from the Atlantic all the way to India and perhaps even to places beyond. And so we come to our timeline. We've seen the persecutions. We've seen the Edict of Toleration. Theodosius, the king who says, we're now going to be a Christian empire. But it won't be too long. By 476, we're going to see the fall of Rome, and that will mark that a splitting of that empire. You will have the East and the West, but we'll see that in a future class.